Doctoral Fellow at the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. Good afternoon to you and welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Adeola, President Buhari has been ill for most of his term. How would you gauge his performance since he spent a significant amount of time abroad to seek medical attention? And now he says that he'll congratulate himself if he wins the election. So why should the Nigerians vote for a person who has been in and out of hospital and in and out of office throughout his term if they are voting for change?
Thank you so much for that fantastic question. I think it is imperative to state at this point that while we await the electoral results, given the fact that they began to trickle in, but then as we wait the final results, at this stage, I think what we're beginning to see is voting patterns along party loyalties, but then also in terms of voter registration by geopolitical zones. We're beginning to see party loyalties and these geopolitical voter registration patterns affecting the nature of election results coming out of the country. But I think in relation to your question as to why vote Buhari, I think that is a very imperative question in light of the fact that there have been concerns over the past years in relation to his government and performance. But then I think also very importantly was the fact that he campaigned on the need to address the issue of corruption in Nigeria. And whilst, of course, in terms of tackling corruption, we've seen some significant improvements, we've not really seen, in relation to the economic side of the conversation, significant effects on the economy and on people generally in Nigeria, which is really one of the main arguments of the opposition party, being that whilst corruption seems to be the focal point that this current administration seeks to tackle in terms of the economic incentives for the people of Nigeria, we've not really seen as much over the past 4 years. But then, be that as it may, the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics actually emphasized that the Nigerian economy had actually experienced significant growth by about 1.9% in 2018, and that the gross domestic product of the country had actually increased by about 2.8% in comparative terms to 2017. And what we see in relation to these improvements, of course, has been issues of foreign direct investment, which has been also quite problematic in a sense in relation to its realization, but then also we began to
let me interrupt you there, Dr. Adeola. Well, I mean, like, the backbone of Nigeria's economy is mainly oil, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, but its proceeds don't really reflect on the citizenry. So where is the government getting it wrong, and how can the people benefit from the economy, which at some point was the #1 performing on the African continent?
Thank you for that question. Indeed, yes, you're right that there's a level of dependency on oil in the country. And in 2014, for instance, when the oil prices peaked, what we saw was the fact that also there was a significant boom in terms of foreign direct investment, but then also in terms of the government revenues that the country received. But then, given the way in which the oil prices have also undulated in more recent times, we've began to observe, and of course the government as well, given the issue of recession and of course the need to sort of stimulate economic growth, has also recognized the fact that it is imperative to think about economic diversification. And that's really where there's been a lot of conversation as to what other forms of revenues can the government generate, and there's been a lot of conversations around agriculture. But then there's also the concern of massive youth unemployment and not really harnessing the demographic dividend of the youth wealth in the country, and of course in relation to the service industry, ensuring that that also receives significant boom in a sense, given the fact that of course dependence on oil, whilst being essential of course for the economy, is not really sustainable over a long period of time. And I think that if the government has to ensure moving forward that the economy is stimulated, it would be imperative for the government to consider moving away from the oil dependency, which is really where our exports.
So just Dr. Ramola, very briefly, you know, when it comes to political risk, there's a protracted contestation or the Boko Haram in the Niger Delta. And this is an impediment to foreign direct investment, as you have mentioned there. So how will Nigeria overcome this? Because to be in competition with countries like South Africa and Egypt for the #1 spot in terms of economic performance is really going to be a tedious task if he has to turn the economy around, deal with unemployment, and alleviate poverty.
Right. You're right about the fact that we've seen the impact of Boko Haram, violent extremism, as with other countries, but then also particularly in the north region of Nigeria, and the impact it has on the economy, as with the Niger Delta crisis over the last decade and more. But then also there's been the herdsmen crisis in the central region of the country. And all of these issues, of course, affecting investor confidence, given the fact that there is this perceived political instability in the country. And I'd say that moving forward, if the government is to stimulate the economy, it is imperative to pay close attention to these issues, but then not adopt a top-bottom approach, which is often the case where you find the national government giving solutions, whilst at the other hand, these issues are being faced by regular Nigerians and even by state governments. But there has to be a cooperative approach in resolving these issues. And there's also been conversations around talking about peace over a securitization approach to the Boko Haram conflict and crisis. But then much more importantly is the concern of youth unemployment being rather endemic, and the fact that in addressing some of the socio-economic issues that force people to join some of these extremist groups, it is imperative for the states to also begin to think around how to curb illiteracy rates, but then also how to stimulate the socio-economic conditions of persons across Nigeria for the purpose of addressing the pertinent concerns.
All right. On that note, thank you very much for making time to speak to us. Dr. Adeola Ramola is Doctoral Fellow at the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. Let's take a break and